Uh, I have it here in this lovely little book. It is 140 pages. So it is a pretty substantial piece of a body of law that has evolved over the last 53 years. So one of the overarching themes of it, though, is that Act 250 is highly fact dependent. And so as we start talking about this, and as we start talking about other bills related to Act 250, you will be tempted to ask me to determine if a certain situation will require an Act 250 permit. And I will do my best to respond, but as we start to look at these elements, it is a highly fact-specific analysis that needs to be done. And so everything that I will tell you about Act 250 comes to the caveat of it depends on the specifics of the situation. So I'll start there. You may be familiar with municipal zoning, which is one type of land use regulation that we have in Vermont. But Act 250 is a separate program that is similar to it in that it is a state land use regulation. So on the first slide, the first sentence that's under the title is, no person shall sell a subdivision, commence development, or commence construction of development or subdivisions without an Act 250 permit. That comes out of 10 VSA 6081A, and that is the sort of guiding question when we're talking about Act 250. So overall, Act 250 regulates the construction, broadly speaking, regulates the construction of large-scale development in Vermont. It requires that large development address a number of community and environmental criteria to demonstrate that the applicant, the developer, has considered the different aspects of the project and whether or not they will have a negative impact on Vermont and the people who live in it. So largely speaking, when we're talking about Act 250, we're talking about whether or not a construction project needs to get a permit. So the first slide has the definition of development. That first sentence, that no one shall sell a subdivision or commence development or commence construction, most of the words in that sentence are defined terms. There are a lot of very specific terms in Act 250, a lot of very specific vocabulary. Definition of development has a number of things that fall under it. I have them on this slide 1, and there are 3 big ones that are highlighted in yellow, but I will go through all of them briefly so that you are aware of what are the types of things that trigger Act 250. So first, development includes the construction of improvements for commercial, industrial, or residential use above the elevation of 2,500 feet. The construction of improvements for any commercial or industrial purpose on more than 10 acres of land, or on more than 1 acre of land if the municipality does not have both permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws. The construction of 10 or more units of housing, or the construction or maintenance of mobile home parks or mobile homes or mobile home parks with 10 or more units within a radius of 5 miles. The construction of improvements for a governmental purpose, so that would include municipal, county, or state purpose. If the project involves more than 10 acres. And so the case law in Act 250 often refers to this as the public, if there's a public purpose instead of a commercial purpose. I'm going to double back and go through these in more detail in a minute. The construction of a support structure that is primarily for communication or broadcast purposes that extends 50 feet or more in height above the ground or 20 feet or more above the highest point of an attached existing structure. So that's telecommunications towers. The exploration of fissionable source material beyond the reconnaissance phase or the extraction or processing of fissionable source material. The drilling of an oil or gas well. or any withdrawal of more than 340,000 gallons of groundwater per day from any well or spring on a single tract of land or at a place of business independent of the acreage of the tract of land. So that is a pretty broad list. It does cover things beyond just typical construction. But very often in the legislature, when we talk about Act 250, we are often talking about the three main definitions of development, which are the construction, either for a commercial purpose or an industrial purpose, or construction of housing, or construction for a governmental purpose. So there are different metrics in these different ones. So if we go back to the first highlighted one, the construction of improvements for any commercial or industrial purpose on more than 10 acres of land, or on more than 1 acre of land if there's no zoning. So here again is another sort of distinction. If this is going to be a commercial construction project, is it going to be located in a town that has zoning, or is there no zoning? If there's no zoning in the town, the question is whether or not the parcel the project is located is more than 1 acre. If it's in a town with zoning, it's on more than 10 acres. And the theory there is that if the town has zoning, there is more in-depth municipal review of the project, or any in-depth review by the municipality, and so smaller projects will be reviewed by the municipality, and so it takes more land, larger projects to trigger Act 250 review.
Do you know at this point in time how many towns in Vermont have permanent zoning and subdivision bylaw?
I do. So the natural resources, and this creates what we refer to colloquially as 10-acre towns or 1-acre towns. And because the NRB has to regularly look at this, they do maintain a list on their website. They review municipal bylaws to determine if they are meeting this definition of permanent subdivision and zoning bylaws. So it has to be both. So it is it's a little more than 50%. So when you start looking at S100, you may hear the statistic that more than 70% of towns have zoning, but under Act 250, there's a very specific level that needs to be met in that they are both permanent and include and address subdivisions. And so not all towns have done that. Some of them only are operating with interim bylaws. Some of them have different ways that they structure it. So for Act 250 purposes, there is a list on the NRB's website, and it's approximately 50%. It's a little more than 50% now.
Sometimes I hear people say, oh, if a town is a town, an approved town plan. So that is like one of the criteria for whether or not you have permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws. But it's unclear to me what the relationship is between having an approved town plan and zoning and subdivision bylaws.
So no, the town plan, so a town plan is the first step. You need to have a town plan in order to adopt bylaws. So it's the first step. A large percentage of towns have adopted some form of a town plan, but taking the next step to adopting zoning bylaws based on that plan, some towns have not done that. The town plan does come into play under criterion 10 of the Act 250 review process. So it is relevant to the Act 250 review, but not as part of the 10-acre town distinction. Okay, so commercial purpose is also a defined term, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. But for the purposes of Act 250, commercial purpose generally means anything that isn't done by the government or individual residences. And there's some variation there, but residential development does have its own category, but that's usually referring to something that is owned by the person who's going to live there. So anyone who's constructing homes in order to sell them to other people, that is a commercial purpose. So it generally applies to almost everything, including if there isn't a direct exchange of money in the traditional sense, because churches have been found to be for a commercial purpose under Act 250. The next big one is the one that you're probably going to hear a lot about when we talk about S100, is the construction of housing units. And so, unlike for commercial purpose, housing units is triggered by the number of units that are constructed, and that's the construction of 10 or more units within 5 miles within 5 years. So the 5 years isn't on the slide, but we will be talking about that quite a bit. And so that's sort of a parameter around this construction. And part of the intent behind that was so that developers weren't attempting to get out of Act 250 jurisdiction by sort of slowly applying to Act 250 over time. It's under Act 250, it's considered that if the one person is doing construction of housing units within 5 years and within the 5 mile radius, they're considered to be part of the same housing project. And then finally, I'll just touch briefly on the public purpose ones. So we don't need to spend too much time on this because it isn't necessarily coming up here, but construction of improvements by the governmental agency, a governmental entity, triggers Act 250 if it involves more than 10 acres of land. And there's a distinction between commercial industrial projects and public projects in that when you look at a commercial project, the question is whether the parcel on which the project will be located is more than 10 acres in size. However, for the government, the question is whether or not there will be 10 or more acres of disturbed land. So what this really means is that it takes more acres of land for the government to trigger Act 250. All right, so we'll go on to the next slide, please. So slide number 2, again, the overarching parameter here is that no person shall sell a subdivision, commence development, or commence construction of a development or subdivisions without an Act 250 permit. So what does subdivision mean? Subdivision means tract or tracts of land owned or controlled by a person that the person has partitioned or divided for the purpose of resale into 10 or more lots within a 5 mile radius on any point on any lot or in the jurisdictional area of the same district commission within any continuous period of 5 years. In determining the number of lots, a lot shall be counted if any portion is within 5 miles or within the jurisdictional area of the same district commission. So someone who is subdividing property, 10 or more lots, triggers Act 250. If the town has zoning, because definition number 2 says tracts or tract of land owned or controlled by a person that the person has partitioned or divided for the purpose of resale into 6 or more lots within 5 years in a municipality that does not have duly adopted permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws. So again, like the commercial purpose jurisdictional trigger under development, in a town without zoning, there's a lower threshold because there's less municipal oversight. So 6 lots, the division of 6 lots triggers Act 250. And in a town with zoning, 10 lots triggers Act 250.
But that provision about within a radius of 5 miles or within the jurisdictional area of the same district commission does not apply. Is that not there, or is that or does it those
for 6
in the middle bullet there?
I don't know. Let me see. I'm not sure if I just didn't include all of it or. No, it doesn't say on this. It doesn't say on number 2 that that I can look.
Okay, well, I'm just curious because it seems that it's more restrictive if you're in a town without permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws, but that controlling feature of within 5 miles is there, so if you're more liberal in that way, just trying to sort out what's the thinking.
Yeah, well, in number 3, it's further slightly different as well. And so then number 3 also says the sale by public auction of any interest in tracts or tracts of land owned or controlled by a person that has been partitioned or divided for resale into 5 or more lots within a radius of 5 miles and within 10 years. So, and that is a fairly old provision in Act 250, and I think the part of the intent there is that public auction should have a lower threshold. I don't know, but yeah.
So on the very first bullet where it's within 5 miles, but also or within a continuous, or
Within the
within the
jurisdiction.
jurisdictional area.
Yeah.
So their target is it right? We have 9 district commissions. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So that could be a large area, well beyond 5 miles.
Mm-hmm.
I never heard that within the district commission's jurisdictional area. That would be through all that's county. That's
Yes, they largely are. So there are 9 district commissions. They are made up of largely along the county lines, and so most of them include more than one county, but there are some divisions. And there is case law on that, and I can look into it. I don't know it off the top of my head. All right, so let's go to slide 3. So is an Act 250 permit required? So just as a review of what I just talked about, this is a brief and incomplete analysis for illustrative purposes only. So if you're going to construct something, what is the purpose of the development? Is it for a commercial purpose or a governmental purpose? Commercial/industrial. If it is for a commercial purpose, does the town in which it is located have permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws? Is it a 1-acre town or is it a 10-acre town? If the project is in a 1-acre town, is more than 1 acre of land involved? If it's in a 10-acre town, is more than 10 acres involved? So for a commercial project, as I mentioned before, involved land means the whole tract of land that's owned by the person. So is the tract of land 10 acres or larger than 1 acre in a 1-acre town? If an Act 250 permit is required, the applicant must demonstrate that the project will comply with the 10 criteria of Act 250. So as we just discussed, there are 9 district commissions in the Act 250 program. So I'll take a step back for a second to talk about the agency that the governmental entity that regulates Act 250. So the Natural Resources Board is the body that oversees the entire Act 250 program. They are a board that is appointed by the governor. The chair of the board is a full-time position. The 4 other members of the board are per diem based and largely only interact with the program when they have their monthly and sort of yearly meetings. But then within the sort of main office of the NRP, there's also a couple of attorneys as well as technicians and business office people. But then most of the large Act 250, the review, the large part of the work is done in reviewing these applications, and that happens at the district commission. So a district commission, there are 9 of them. The commission is made up of 3 volunteer positions. There's a chair and then 2 members of the district commission. They are all appointed by the governor, and they are sort of volunteer in that they do receive per diem compensation for when they work on the Act 250 permits, but it's a nominal fee of $50 per day. And so there's also a district coordinator for each district as well. And so when someone needs an Act 250 permit, they are going to have to demonstrate compliance with all the elements of the permit, which I'll talk about on the next page. But the application is submitted to the district coordinator. The district coordinator reviews the application for completeness, answers any questions that the applicant might have on what types of things they may need to submit. And then the district coordinator helps staff the district commission and helps them do their review of the application. And so they really are an integral sort of staff member in this process. The other thing that a district coordinator does is that there's a process under Act 250 known as a jurisdictional opinion. So this slide 3 that I have is a really basic, high-level sort of questions that you can ask to get an idea of if you may need an Act 250 permit. But there is someone whose job it is to make this official determination, and it's the district coordinator. So if anyone is unsure if they need an Act 250 permit, they can request what is known as a jurisdictional opinion from the district coordinator, who will do a much more in-depth analysis than what is here on this slide, but something like this. They'll look at the other jurisdictional triggers and determine if a permit is going to be needed. This determination can be sought by anyone. So not only someone who is looking to do a to do construction of something, but also by someone who is wondering if a development that is a third party can ask if something requires a permit. This determination can be appealed to the environmental court and then to the Supreme Court.
Never said that sentence before.
What?
No, it's just
Sorry. Yes. First we go to the E-Court, then we go to the Supreme Court. So there are 2 levels of appeals past decisions in Act 250.
We no longer have appeals to the board.
Correct.
When did we change? Because they used to.
2004. Yes, 20 years ago, appeals did not go to the environmental court. They went to the Natural Resources Board. However, at this point in time, the Natural Resources Board is largely a sort of guiding agency. They don't have quasi-judicial authority. They mostly have administrative authority over the agency.
When you use the term environmental court, is that the same thing as the environmental division of Superior Court?
Yes.
Okay.
Previously, 20 years ago, it was known as the Environmental Court. However, due to judicial reorganization, it is technically the Environmental Division of the Superior Court. It is one of the divisions of the Superior Court, like family court or criminal court or civil court. And there are 2 judges that staff the Environmental Court in our division.
Thank you, Chair Bray. I realize that this is a very, very high level overview, and I'm wondering if we wanted to do out of committee time research, if there was a environmental court person, maybe it's not a judge, but someone who could talk to us, because I've heard a little bit about some of the concerns coming out of the already existing judicial struggles and how they're pulling a little bit. Is there someone who we might, if I wanted to ask them some questions as we look into this, you might recommend?
Councilor Zone, I think.
So yes,
Judge
Judge Zone has been, is the sort of public person from the court who speaks about their workload and their workflow. But if you have other questions, we can talk. What kind of questions?
Well, it's more about how is it functioning right now.
Oh, okay.
I heard that he had given testimony in another committee that made it, yeah, just the flags around actual process versus what we asked them to do with trying to pull judges from potentially other places or,
Even timeliness concerns or.
more that there's a competition potentially with some of the environmental court time needed and other things that they want to do. So, but I'll connect with Judge Zone, who is from our area.
Okay. All right, so if an Act 250 permit is required, we'll go to slide 4. If a permit is required, an applicant must demonstrate compliance with the 10 criteria of Act 250. That is what they are called. However, you will notice on this slide that there are far more than 10. But There are 10 big criteria and then sub-criteria underneath them. So when an applicant is looking to apply for a project, they need to address, the district commission needs to review whether or not the project will have an impact under any of these criteria. And whether or not that impact can be mitigated, whether or not changes to the project can be made to lessen that impact. So first, I guess I'll just run through them. So first, criterion 1 asks whether or not the project will result in undue water or air pollution. And then there are 7 sub-criteria underneath that only speak to water. So this is sort of one of the unusual things about Act 250, but water is captured in the first criterion and then the subsequent sub-criteria underneath it, but air is only mentioned in this first one. So really what we're talking about here are 8 separate criteria. So 8 separate questions are being asked. Will the project result in undue water pollution? Will the project result in undue air pollution? Then you look at the other sub-criteria in addition. So will there be an impact on the headwaters? And there's specific language in Act 250 about what is included in headwaters. Is it in the watershed? Is it above 1,500 feet in elevation? So there's a lot of individual questions that happen there. Next is waste disposal, wastewater and stormwater. So will there be any, will the project will the project meet the applicable health and environmental standards related to waste? Next is flood hazard areas and water conservation. Does the project incorporate water conservation and has that been considered? Then you look at if there's going to be any flood hazard area and river corridor aspects if the project is located in one of those areas. Next, is it located on a stream or will there be any impacts related to streams? And then shorelines and wetlands. So these are a lot of different aspects. Not every project will need to address them specifically, but they will need to demonstrate that they have looked into it. So for example, it may be very easy for an applicant to look at the shoreline criteria because they may not be located on a lake or pond where there is in fact a shoreline, but they will need to state in their application, we looked, there was no shoreline impact because we don't have a shoreline. Similarly with wetlands, and there may not be any headwaters or streams, or they may not be located in a river corridor or flood hazard area. But every project will likely need to address what they're doing about water pollution and air pollution. And they will need to address how they're handling their waste disposal. So that's true for most of the rest of these criteria as well, where depending on the specific circumstances of the project, they may not need to do in-depth analysis of all of the criteria, but they will need to at least address in their application that they have looked into it. That was it. Yeah.
Yeah, back in the day, the applicant would just write NA for not applicable. Right. So,
but at least that has a demonstration
It's
that
an answer.
it's an answer,
That's
right?
right.
So we want to, and Vermont has a lot of variation depending on where you are in the state. And so these criteria are intended to address as many situations as possible, but they may not apply to every project. That's really why project-specific questions are difficult to answer on the fly, because it really is fact dependent on what is on the site and what the project is actually going to consist of.
Can you say a little bit about relationship of getting your Act 250 permit and other permits, so with, for instance, stormwater, and how does examining, and then you get into things like rebuttable perceptions of compliance. Can you connect us to the world of permits?
Sure. So when a applicant is looking to demonstrate that they have complied with the criterion, they have a number of options. They may just be able to write NA, but with some of these, there will need to be some aspects of a project addressed. Act 250 is an umbrella program. It has holistic review. It doesn't interfere with any other agency's specific jurisdiction. And so if there is existing jurisdiction under the Agency of Natural Resources that requires a specific stormwater permit or wastewater permit or air pollution permit, those permits will need to be approved by that agency before the Act 250 final approval can take place. Sometimes if it's in process, they may be able to issue the Act 250 permit with the condition that the A&R permit be finally issued before the construction can take place. But usually the applicant is going to need to have gotten their permits before the Act 250 review is finalized. And part of that is because those permits are relevant information to demonstrate compliance with the criteria. There is a list in the Act 250 rules, in Rule 19, I believe, that lists which permits from the state agencies serve as presumptions of compliance with the criteria. This is rebuttable presumption. And so an applicant, for example, may submit an air pollution permit that they got from the Agency of Natural Resources to demonstrate that they have complied with criterion 1. But an opponent may be able to introduce evidence that that air pollution permit has not sufficiently addressed air pollution concerns and may be able to rebut that presumption and require additional mitigation of some sort. So there is a pre-approved list that the agency has included in their rules. Other permits can be submitted as demonstration of compliance, but the district commission will then need to evaluate whether or not that is a sufficient demonstration.
If another party wishes to rebut a permit, what's the process for challenging that permit's validity in terms of satisfying the criteria?
In order to do that, you would need to be a party to the Act 250 proceeding. So they would need to gain party status before the district commission. And so I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I'll try to jump in here and say, after the applicant has addressed all the criteria, they will submit their application, it will be reviewed, and it will go to the district commission. At which point it will be determined whether or not the permit is a major permit or a minor permit. The primary distinction there is whether or not there are significant impacts under any of the criteria that are identified, and really if there's going to be a hearing held on the permit. If there is a hearing held, it will be held by the district commission. It is a less formal process than a judicial court proceeding, but it does have some similarities and formal rules about it, which include, if they're open to the public, but if someone wants to present evidence or participate directly in the proceeding, they're going to need to obtain party status. Also, I'm giving a very high level view of this, and I'm feeling a little intimidated given that there is at least one expert in the room right now, not just you, but you are an expert as well.
I think my expertise is dated, somewhat dated.
Well, relevant to like the proceedings of, I'm giving a very like skimming overview of how the proceedings work, but.
Well, I can also sort of withdraw the permit question so we can get all the way through.
I mean, this is my last slide because I didn't know how in-depth you wanted to go into the permit proceedings. But someone would need to demonstrate that they have that they would be impacted by one of the criteria unless something was addressed in the permit application. And so if they were able to make that first demonstration of a particularized interest, they'll be able to present evidence at the hearing related to that. And so it would happen at the district commission level hearing. But if someone wanted to appeal a decision beyond what is made at the district commission, they will need to have gained party status before the district commission in order to be able to appeal further potentially to the environmental division.
You said that when it comes to the commission, they determine whether it's a major or minor permit and based on impacts. Can you say a little more about like how they judge it to be major or minor?
No, I can give you a briefly, if anyone requests a hearing
Wow,
on a permit, that makes it a major,
okay.
because clearly someone is interested in discussing the impacts. Sometimes I do think they can tell based on the size of the project and the type of project. I can't really speak more in depth than that.
Again, this is old information, but often the determination of whether something was a major or a minor was determined by a phone call between the chair of the commission and the administrator. What do we call the administrator?
The coordinator?
Coordinator.
The coordinator.
And discussing what was involved, and often the coordinator would advise that this strikes me as a minor. And the chair agreed or not agree. Ultimately, I think it was up to the chair. This might be a good moment, though, could, if not right now, at some point in your presentation, speak to the claim that we hear that the trouble with Act 250 is that anyone can come in and stop it for a permit at any time. Because this is,
Sure. Yeah, so I was just talking about that a little bit. So, when a permit application is submitted, there is a public announcement that is made. Notice of the application is made public, but direct notice is applied, sent to a number of specific people. The agencies that are impacted, so usually ANR, potentially the Agency of Agriculture as well, the municipality in which the project will be located, the regional planning commission where the project will be located, the directly adjacent neighbors to the parcel. And then there will also be public notice. So the public are welcome to the public hearings on applications. But as I was just starting to discuss, in order to be a party in the proceeding, so there's also notice given to the landowner if they are not the applicant of the project. Anyone can attend the public hearing. If they would like to, in order to appeal an Act 250 permit decision, however, you need to have party status granted by the district commission. And that gives you the ability to participate in the hearing and present evidence, but it also gives you the right to appeal. So in order to have party status, you need to demonstrate a particularized interest in one or more of the criteria. And the district commission will evaluate that application and whether or not you have demonstrated that you have a particularized interest under one or more of the criteria. And so the commission can decide, and based on that criteria that you are awarded party status under, that is what you are limited in your ability to participate in relation to. So if, for example, someone applied for all 10 criteria, but the district commission said, well, you live farther away, it's not necessarily going to have an impact on your water supply because you live farther away. So we're not giving you party status under criterion 3 or criterion 2. But because you drive by the area, you may be impacted by traffic congestion or unsafe highway practice layouts. So, all right, you may have a particularized interest under the traffic criteria. A very common one is criterion 8, which we haven't gotten to, but it's the aesthetics criteria, which is the scenic view. And so based on what criteria you are awarded party status under, that is what you are limited to your participation on. And so it is a standard. It is not an automatic grant. And after the close of the hearing, the party status that has been awarded is reviewed on whether or not the interested person actually met that burden and actually did demonstrate a particularized interest. And so party status can be lost after the hearing as well. And the law party status is what is needed in order to appeal any decision. And so, how did I do there? Yes. It is not an automatic, anyone can attend the hearing, but not anyone can participate. It is, you need to demonstrate a particularized interest in an impact under one or more of the criteria.
Senator Watson.
Thank you. This is going back a bit. I have a question about criterion 1. So we have listed A through G, which are all related to water pollution. Are there sub-paragraphs there about air pollution that are not included?
Nope.
There's just nothing.
Yep.
What?
So, but criterion 1 itself is a full criteria. It's
Okay.
doing a lot of work.
Okay, so.
You know,
Okay, so like,
The
if I
environmental
understand,
report.
I mean, I'm not looking at it, so, that there is a, like, under criterion 1, there's like a paragraph with the heading with undue water and air pollution, and that's where the air pollution stuff lives.
Yeah.
It's just not broken out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is odd. And a couple years ago, this committee looked at giving it its own criteria so that if it's air pollution. But.
Oh, you mean like as a number 11?
Yeah,
Well, it seems like it could be paragraph G, you know, like the
I mean,
section G, but
it's
or
doing
not
a lot,
GH.
it's doing a lot of work, honestly.
okay.
And air pollution review is extremely common as part of almost every
Yeah.
application review.
Sorry if I may continue. So, how are we? Is air pollution must be defined?
Yes, yes. I think almost every word on this page is defined.
Wow,
Yes.
that's
And if not,
Makes
and if not, yes, the definition section, so when we get into the bill, the definition section of Act 250 is section 6001, and it alone,
it's the law.
it's like this many pages. So the definition section in Act 250 is doing like a substantial amount of work also for the program, because the language I talked to you about on the first slide about what we call the jurisdictional triggers,
Yeah.
development and subdivision, those live in the definition section. And so like the sentence that I described, no person shall, is in section 81 of Act 250. Like we don't even get to like the primary like legislative mandate until later. And so most people, when they're looking at Act 250, they are looking at the definition section. So there's a definition section in the Act 250 statute. There's also a definition section in the Act 250 rules. And there's also a substantial amount of terms that have been defined through case law, because even though this law is very long, it's not that long.
Okay.
So yes, and because we're 53 years in, so many questions have been asked and determined in the court system.
Okay.
I have
Yes.
some more questions, but I'm gonna pull them on.
Okay, so we can talk, see this slide, we can talk about this for an entire day or
Yes.
weeks.
You were feeling like you didn't know what you wanted to do this weekend.
Now I know.
There's like reading after.
It's a good reading.
You might want to put a pin in this question. This might not be the time. But when we were talking about party status, you might also want to talk about materially assisting.
I don't really want to talk about that, but we,
You don't have to.
right, and friends of the commission.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it does kind of depend on what other, that is like really deep in the weeds that I don't
Okay,
know
okay.
if we're like, 'cause- so just as a preview, when we get to S100, a number of changes are being made to the Act 250 jurisdictional triggers and large, and exemptions to the permit amendment process. So nothing specifically related to the hearing and appeal process is in the bill. So do you want to make sure you have enough information on, but obviously the process, the activity process itself is relevant to whether or not things should be exempt. So there's a little bit of a tension.
So I'm guilty of asking these leading questions, so I'm gonna not do that, but can we sort of pop back up so that we can go higher level, so we can get through all 10 criteria? And then there is a term that is coming up, unreasonable, undue, and can we, once we've, I don't know if you wanna say something about that before we start using those terms over and over again, or go through them all and come back and then we can see, well, what does undue or unreasonable mean?
Sure, and yeah, so if you look at criterion 1, there is, obviously this is not the full text of the statute that describes criterion 1, but I will read the first sentence and I'll do so as we go through the other criteria, because the other criteria are different, but an applicant needs to demonstrate and the commission needs to find, so 1, that the project will not result in undue air or water pollution. It does not say that the project will result in water or air pollution. It says undue water or air pollution. And so in that, there is an acknowledgement that any time something is done, there may be impacts to air or water. And so there is some leeway there that a project needs to demonstrate that they're not creating undue amounts of pollution. This is different than some of the other standards under some of the other criteria. For example, number 2 is kind of an odd one in that number 2 asks, does the project have sufficient water available for the reasonably foreseeable needs of the project? And that seems like a pretty basic question, but that's slightly different of whether or not there's an undue negative impact. But number 3 goes back to undue, and it's asked whether or not the project will cause an unreasonable burden on the existing water supply. So again, asking about, that's more of a community sort of question of whether or not the water supply that's serving the community is going to be unduly impacted.
Is the reason it seems like 2 and 3 seem very similar is 1, if you have your own water supply, it's a drilled well, you're looking at 2. And if you're gonna go out to the municipal system, it's 3. I don't quite know.
So 2 is literally 1 sentence, that's like 10 words long. 3 does, the words that I left off on 3, so 3 is will not cause an unreasonable burden on an existing water supply if 1 is being used. So I do think they are technically 2 different questions, but they do relate to each other pretty strongly. And so the first one is asking, do you have enough water? Did you consider this? That is a pretty basic question. The second one asks, is your plan for water going to be impacting anyone else? Number 4, the project will not cause unreasonable soil erosion or reduction in the capacity of the land to hold water so that a dangerous or unhealthy condition may result. So 4 is about soil erosion, but it does ask if it will be dangerous or unhealthy. Soil erosion will probably happen, but is it unreasonable? Number 5 is the traffic criterion. It asks whether or not the project will cause unreasonable congestion or unsafe conditions with respect to the use of the highways, waterways, railways, airports, and airways. Within the traffic criteria, there's also another criteria that I didn't list, but it goes on to ask about will the project incorporate transport demand management strategies?
Yeah.
So, and it goes on to discuss whether or not pedestrian, bicycle, or transit network services. So there's additional criteria, but that's sort of known as the traffic criteria. Are you going to negatively impact the road on which you are and make it unsafe? Criterion 6 then asks whether or not there will be an unreasonable burden on the educational services, well, on the ability of the municipality to provide educational services. Are you seeking to put a 20,000 unit development in a town of 800 people? That may overburden the local school district. Number 7 is similar. Will there place an unreasonable burden on the ability of the local government to provide municipal and governmental services, including like fire, EMT, things like that. And then 8 is one of the big ones. Criterion 8 asks, will the project have an undue adverse impact? Sorry, it does not say that. Will the project have an undue adverse effect on the scenic or natural beauty of the area, aesthetics, historic sites, or rare and irreplaceable natural areas? So this is a big one. The aesthetics criteria is one of the Act 50 permit criteria that lead to controversy. Underneath it as well, it asks whether or not there will be impacts on necessary wildlife and endangered species habitat. Necessary wildlife habitat and threatened or endangered species. I'm going to skip over criterion 9 for a moment, go down to criterion 10. It asks whether or not the project is in conformance with local or regional plan. So it does look at whether or not a project conflicts with local zoning. And then criterion 9 is the weird one. It's a little bit unusual. Criterion 9, as it was enacted in 1970, read, is the project in conformance with the capability and development plan and the land use plan once those are adopted? Those have never been adopted. So, as part of Act 250, as it was originally enacted in 1970, there was provision that a capability and development plan and the related land use plan be adopted, which would be a statewide map with a statewide land use map, something similar to statewide zoning or something a little bit lighter than that, but a map that would be used as part of the review of Act 250 for the state land use regulation. However, in 1973, the legislature repealed that part of it. And so this language was sort of dangling out there, what should be used instead. And so criterion 9 has many sub-criterion underneath it that attempt to sort of get at that similar concept. And they are related to different aspects of a community and at least partially relate to sprawl. But there are a bunch of other things in here too. So criterion 9A looks at the impacts of growth. So shall take into consideration the growth in population experienced by the town and region and whether or not the development will significantly affect their existing and potential financial capacity to reasonably accommodate both the total growth and the rate of growth. And it goes on. It's a very long paragraph. Criterion 9B is an entirely different topic. Criterion 9B asks if the project is going to impact the primary agricultural soils on the site, if there will be any reduction in the agricultural potential of the primary agricultural soils. And there's an entire process on how that impact would be mitigated if there are primary agricultural soils on the site. Next, criterion C is slightly related to this. It looks at whether there will be an impact on productive forest soils on the site. Criteria D and E relate to each other as well. So criterion D looks at whether or not the development will impact the will it prevent or significantly interfere with the potential for the extraction of mineral or earth resources. And then E looks at whether or not if there's going to be an extraction of earth resources, what needs to be demonstrated there. Criterion 9F is another big one in that it asks if there is energy conservation contemplated in the project. And this is fairly important because it's one of the ways that the state's residential and commercial building energy standards are reviewed and looked at in a project. Criterion 9G looks at private utility services. Criterion 9H looks at the cost of scattered development. J is public utility services. K is public investments. And 9L is settlement patterns. And so both H and L relate to sprawl and whether or not the project is contributing to sprawl. So those are the 10 active criteria.
Thank you. Do you want to tackle the, how we define, things like undue impact, undue burden,
Oh.
unreasonable?
Well, I sort of
They
already,
sound subjective in a way, but how do we draw that line?
well, they are subjective. And the reason is because every situation in Act 250, this is highly fact-specific determinations that are being made. So we do have some different adjectives for each criteria, although they sort of fall into some similar buckets. So we have undue pollution, undue burden, unreasonable, and then the number 8 is the one where there's a lot of case law defining. Number 8 is undue adverse effect, and so I think most of these acknowledge the first step is that there is going to be an effect or an impact, and it's a two-step analysis. Is there that negative impact caused by the project? And then it asks whether or not that impact is undue. So is it too much? And what can be done to mitigate those negative impacts? And so I'll also just say, sort of to wrap that up, which is when the district commission is reviewing these criteria as part of the application, they have 3 choices. They can approve the permit, they can deny the permit, or they can approve it with conditions mitigating the impacts found under these criteria. And that's the most common thing that happens. The prior statistic that I had heard was 98% of Act 250 applications are approved. However, I heard recently that it's gone up. And you should hear from the NRB soon because their annual report either just came out or is about to come out on their annual report that has the number of applications that were made and how many were approved. And I think I heard that it was over 400 last year. So a significant number of these Act 250 permits are submitted every year for approval, and a large number are approved. The vast majority of them, however, contain conditions that are intended to mitigate an impact under one or more of these criteria. So by way of example, one thing you may be asking, what is missing from this list? It's such a long list. One thing that's not specifically mentioned by name, but is part of the Act 250 analysis that does come up is noise. Noise in a project may come up as an issue under either criterion 8 for aesthetics, or it may come up under criterion 1, air pollution, if the noise is at such a rate that it has a health impact. So if someone raises that there is a negative impact caused by noise caused by the project, that can be addressed or mitigated by setting a condition in the permit. So sometimes this may be the loud machinery that's being used cannot be used past 5 p.m. on weekdays, or things like that. So to address a concern that there will be a negative impact, the permit will include conditions that will adjust how the project will move forward.
And who has enforcement capability over conditions to make sure that they actually are met?
So both the Natural Resources Board currently has 2 enforcement officers. And they investigate complaints, but also they primarily are complaint driven because there's only 2 of them. The Agency of Natural Resources does have some ability to enforce, particularly if they're doing enforcement work on some of their own permits and they see violation. They do have some enforcement authority. I think they usually refer those cases, but there is provision in here that ANR has some ability for enforcement.
We, in this committee, talked about having criteria related to force blocks. And I don't remember exactly where that was going to insert. It was under 8, right? It was
Yes.
Undue adverse effect on natural sites, including force blocks, right?
Yes.
So what would it have been? Was it going to be an 8C? I was thinking 8C, but I don't see a B up there.
It was going to be B and C, yeah. Well, depending on, we've looked at multiple different, but forest blocks would be B, for, connecting habitat might be C, or you could combine them. But yeah, but it probably would be 8B.
You just state those statistics again, of how many.
Right, so I think mine are slightly out of date, but the prior statistic had been that 98% of Act 250 permits were approved. I've heard that it's gone up slightly. But the NRB tracks a lot of statistics.
Former committee mate who became NRB chair, Senator Snell, one of her things was to improve the annual report, to do a lot more reporting out on timeliness. And I think part of that was because she felt like it was, Act 250 was often challenged as being much too slow. And so she wanted data on how fast the permits really issue and how it's moving. Senator Watson.
Well, that was my question. Do you think they have the data on the timing for permits to be issued?
Yes, they definitely do.
And do they have data on the average amount of time for appeals?
Yes. And the court also has that data. So I don't know if the NRB independently tracks it, but the courts do have that data as well. Because the legislature asks for it every year.
That's not surprising.
Yes.
So we'll have the NRB in, we'll get the impact report.
And to ask those questions.
And so just in closing, because I don't know what time you want me to go to, but the great. We've sort of already said this, but once the district commission issues a permit, the permit may be appealed by an interested person who is aggrieved by the decision. That person had to have participated in the proceeding before the district commission. That appeal would go to the environmental division of the Superior Court. And if there was subsequent appeal of that, it would go to the Supreme Court.
And can you remind us the appeal to environmental division? Is that on the record or to know?
It's de novo, which means the appeal is brand new. So the district commission will do findings of fact and law on a permit, but when it gets to the court, the case basically starts anew, and the appeal will be limited in the issues that are being appealed, but the difference with an on-the-record appeal is that the record, it's not an on-the-record appeal. That does sometimes happen in municipal zoning cases, and that's where the record that was developed by the body is then submitted to the court, and the court has a more limited role in fact-finding and review because the work was done at the initial level. But with Act 250, it's de novo to the environmental division.
And is the permit deemed valid? And so the challenge, does the party to whom the permit was issued, is their permit deemed valid, or do they have to demonstrate before the court that they have in fact satisfied all 10 criteria or all their key requirements? So I'm trying to think about whose burden is it? Is there a burden on both the applicant that receives the permit, or is it the burden falls to the appellant? And they have to demonstrate that something criterion 8A was not actually satisfied.
Doesn't that depend on the criteria?
So it does, so at the district commission level, there's a separate statute under Act 250 on who has the burden. And so for most of the criterion, the applicant always has a burden of evidence. They need to submit enough evidence for a finding under one of the criteria to be made. However, under most of the criteria, the burden of proof is on the applicant to demonstrate compliance. However, with some of the criteria, including criterion 8, the burden is on the opponent to demonstrate that the burden has not been met. So you're asking about what happens at the court level, and I'm gonna be honest, at the moment, I don't know off the top of my head.
But
I suppose it probably depends on who is making the appeal.
part of the reason I ask is because the Memphis Committee of the appeal process comes up as a bone of contention, you know. Is it, and some people will say, oh, the appeal process has been weaponized, you know, it's a way of dragging out proceedings for so long that it makes projects untenably expensive, and they just give up. And other people say, well, no, that is not so. So I just think at some point we'll want to understand how appeals work and how timely and or burdensome they are to applicants with their experience.
There are so many intricate details in this process that it's difficult for me to prepare for every question.
You can have a report for us.
I figure you walk in knowing the answer to everything, but I think while we're looking in the coming weeks, so the plan is to have this out before we leave for town meeting. But I know that's a question that come up. I think we're going to receive. I looked at some testimony that was submitted on the development committee side. So I was reading there about concerns around the weaponization of appeals. And certainly that's kind of, you've had experience as the mayor of this city around appeals and how contentious they can become.
Yep.
May cause a project to
Stop.
Yeah.
Sure.
okay. Right.
But if I may, I'm sure you will do this, but just to say it out loud, I mean, Act 100 is a long bill,
Right.
and part of it pertains to Act 250. So I'm just conscious of wanting to make sure that that the testimony that we're taking is just pertinent to the bill.
Well, so after break at 10:30, Senator Robbinsdale will be in for 15 minutes to do the bill sponsor introduction, and then we will shift to a walkthrough with the council of S 100, one I might read through. I don't think we'll get to finish today. We'll pick it back up on Tuesday, and then we'll start with witnesses to go through the bill and some of the back and forth, so we understand.
Well, because my thought is, you know, I'm not feeling the need to relitigate all of Act 250 or unless the appeal process is particularly relevant to changes in this bill. But anyway, just thinking about scope. That's all.
Sure. Yeah, I don't. So to your point, I don't agree.
Yeah.
Since this is really our only block of time allocated to just looking at Act 250, it's Act 250. I know it will come up bit by bit as we work our way through, but this was our one sort of high-level overview of that.
Sure.
Sarah.
Do the statistics exist about, at least as statistics, of who brings appeals? Opponents appealing a permit?
I'm not certain. You can ask the NRB.
So
I want
the NRB will be in.
And the only other thing I'll just flag, their last session, you did pass, well, first of all, the first criterion change that has happened in many years, which was changing flood hazard area to river corridor under 1D. But also in the S226 that passed last year, there was a report required from the Natural Resources Board. That report is due in December of this year. It's looking at a number of issues under Act 250 that we didn't even get to talk about. We talked about the capability of development plan, which is part of that report. But it's the fee structure and the current staffing levels of the NRP are also in there. And I do think there may be appeals questions in there as well. But also looking at whether changing the jurisdictional triggers potentially to more of a land-based trigger than a project-based trigger.
I think they did another report related to on-farm
Oh,
development.
yes, that report came out last month, looking at Act 250 jurisdiction over agricultural businesses.
Right, well, thanks for a perfectly timed 75-minute presentation on Act 250.